Hello everyone and welcome back to episode 10 of this third series of painting A Song of Ice and Fire tabletop game miniatures. In this series we've been painting Ramsay Bolton, the Great John Umber, and Sir Gregor Clegane, the Mountain That Rides. If you've been following along, either with these miniatures or with some other miniatures you have at home, well, we are pretty much done. The varnish has set, the miniatures are looking nice and matte, and they've set up with their final texture. The last things we're going to be doing today is coloring in the metallic areas on them, which I'll do with silver and bronze Vallejo model color paints. And then we will be putting a black outline on the bases to tidy things up, cover up the edges of where our ink wash and everything was applied, and ultimately just make them look a little neater overall. Working with the metallic paints here, I'm going to be tapping my brush, a relatively broad bristled brush that I've worn down quite a lot, just to make sure that the silver paint gets as far up the bristles as I can, before dragging it across the metallic areas. What we're going for here is something sort of similar to dry brushing, which you might have seen in previous episodes, except of course we haven't dried the brush off per se. This is coming out as a really heavy sort of dry brush with the paint itself lodged very deep in the bristles so that we can drag it across the surfaces and get a relatively thick application on all the raised areas. Where dry brushing would be a little more subtle, if we were doing this and then we were wiping off the brush until nothing returned except small detailed areas, as you might do, we would have a very hard time making these armored pieces actually look like they're metallic. However, by keeping the brush pretty heavily loaded and tapping it out, we can apply a really nice silver coating onto these items while leaving a bit of a texture to it because the bristles aren't going to apply evenly, and leaving the darker or recessed areas a little bit darker. This will give you a sort of a beaten steel or dirtier look with a scuffed sort of edged surfaces on all of the metallic areas. You're not going to get the beautiful, shiny, Knights of the Round Table kind of polish, but you are going to get what I think is a really nice weathered look to your metallic areas. Another way to achieve something similar would be to use washes over top of the metallic areas afterwards. If you use like the Citadel paints that Games Workshop produces, they have washes for putting on over metallic areas that'll darken down the recesses post facto, which means you can apply your metallic paint a little bit heavier the first time around. Because I'm limiting myself to a fairly small number of materials to limit cost and also work quickly, I'm not going to be using that extra wash over top, and so I'm going to be using this sort of not quite dry brush to just get a really nice textured look and carry on, get the metals done, get these guys on the table. As you can see, I'm using this wider brush even over smaller areas like the guard on Ramsay's sword or the pommel of his dagger. Generally speaking, I find this works better because the broader bristled brush, with all of its bristles sort of spread out this way, gives a really nice scuffed or scratched texture as you brush on the silver. However, it does have a mild downside insofar as, of course, it's broader than some of the areas you're going to want to color, especially as you get down to belt buckles, for example. What that means is you need to be very careful about getting your silver paint on non-silver areas. Metallic paints are... I don't exactly know why, but they are way more clingy than your other paints or inks that we've been using so far, where those are fairly easy to clean off with a Kleenex or with a clean brush and maybe just a little bit of thinner. The metallic paints will stain any area they get onto, so you need to be careful about where you're putting them. That being said, don't get too worried about it, because like anything else, we can cover it up. And if you watched the last episode, you'll have seen that you can even cover up issues after the miniatures have been varnished, with some success over small areas. The Great John's sword here is a really good example of my technique for applying this, which is to say lots of long, sort of across the entire model, brush strokes, applied generally from the top, because that's the area of the metal that's going to be the most lit, and sort of dragged across the whole surface. Here again on the pauldron, you can see I'm dragging from top to bottom, and trying to just make sure that the highlight gets on reasonably thickly, and also that there is a flow to the almost the grain of the metal texture, and that everything is cohesive that way. Applying your metallic paint is going to do a lot for making these miniatures look like the end product that they really are at this point. If you're like me, this is going to be the moment where finally it's all coming together. You know, the shiny bits, the baubles, and the details, they really make everything pop. Aside from that, though, there isn't a whole lot to talk about the process. Apply it carefully. Don't worry too much if you do make a mistake, but obviously it is in your best interest to avoid making a mistake, just to save yourself the cleanup and cover-up that is required. I'm going to leave you with the footage here, and I will be back to comment as more interesting events occur in the painting process. You can look down in the description, as always, for an index of where my comments are if you want to skip forward. If you do want to keep watching, even on double speed, just so you can see how every area I paint gets painted, that's also potentially a great idea for you. If you would like to follow along with these painting tutorials from start to finish with the exact same materials that I use, first off, let me recommend going to a local art store. For example, I use Michael's in Canada, and I know the franchise extends to the United States because they're a franchise that offers an exorbitant amount of coupons, which means, yeah, their base prices are a little high. But still, as far as comparing it to market price for something like an airbrush, when you get a 50% off coupon, really good deal. If you can't get into a local store that has good prices like this, or that has good deals and offers on the items you're looking for, or you can't find the particular items I'm using and you would like to use those in particular, you can take a look down in the description. I do have Amazon affiliate links. As an Amazon affiliate, I earn on any qualifying purchases you make through those links, not just on the items that are listed, but on any other items you buy after following the link to Amazon. And that is a great way for you to support the channel while also getting something for yourself, so it'd be much appreciated if you do end up using them. Painting Gregor again is going to be quite the undertaking because he has quite a lot of metallic areas on him. However, just try not to get too impatient with your brushwork because there are small details like the brown buckles on his armor, or of course just the yellow barding all around, that we want to preserve and not get too much silver onto. The silver has a pretty overpowering presence, and even disregarding what I said earlier about it being difficult to clean, it will just sort of blot out other colors underneath it just by dint of being so shiny. So especially for something reasonably unassuming like a brown, like these leather straps or the soles of his shoes, that kind of stuff, you do want to try and avoid overpowering it with the silver as much as possible. That being said, his armor has a lot of wonderful texture on it, and also some pretty big areas to show off the sort of effect of brushing on our silver the way we are now. So if you're like me, you'll probably find this pretty satisfying as it goes on, and you start getting that really scuffed, scraped texture from the silver, as well as some really nice shading around the little rivets and the chainmail on his legs, and other items like that. You may want to do like I'm doing here and just touch the edges of the hooves with some silver to give the impression of horseshoes. You could also go in a little more, I guess, detail and do it with a finer brush, but I just used the brush that I was using right now and just gave a little bit of shine to the hooves. I would say that this is an item that might have been better sculpted on and painted because the silver doesn't have quite the effect I was looking for. But at quick glance, especially at tabletop distance, I do get the impression of horseshoes, and so mission accomplished. Watch out while you're doing this though, because the flock is another great contender for something that, if it does get silver on it, just won't look quite right. If you get some silver where you didn't want it, try and respond as quickly as possible. Get a clean brush, preferably maybe even a wet one or one with just a little bit of thinner, although you don't want to mess with your varnish now that it's applied, so certainly don't use a whole lot of thinner, if any at all. Try to wipe it away. Kleenex or something can work as well. Just be very, very careful. At this point, if you're applying too much friction, you might actually scrape away your varnished finish or even scrape away the paint. Responding quickly will mean that you get the vast majority of the silver away, though as I mentioned before, it will stain a little bit onto any normal color it lands on. If it's too big of a deal, go back in, and as I pointed out in my previous video, you can mix some Mod Podge in with a color to get an actual colored finish that will still come out reasonably matte. So for small areas, you could use that to touch up as well. Alternately, you could just touch up normally and hit it with a little more varnish. We're going to move on now to using some bronze color for the details on Gregor Clegane's armor, in particular that fist on top of his helmet. I thought making everything iron, while it did sort of correspond with his reputation and his general bearing as a giant golem, you know, bearing down with deathly seriousness on his enemies and all that, just making him all iron was a little boring. So, while I don't think that he would necessarily be one for particularly ornate trappings or anything, there are a few little trimmings that would speak to his status as a knight, I think, that I wanted to highlight. One is, of course, these rondels over the eyes of the horse. Trying to apply the bronze reasonably lightly so that we leave the area in the center of it dark, although I don't think I really accomplished that. You may want to go in with a smaller brush if you want to make sure you leave the center of the eyes dark. I am applying this bronze much heavier than we applied the silver because I'm not trying to get that hammered effect now. The sort of textured hammered look wouldn't really work all that much for bronze necessarily, which of course these are going to be details that are cast probably to be added on to the armor. As such, I'm applying this thickly and using the silver that we've already applied as a sort of undercoat that's going to make it pop a little bit and make it look a little brighter. Another way we're going to make it look bright is by using gold paint. Now gold paint on its own is pretty overwhelming. You can see how bright and yellow that is, and really is just going to completely overpower the silver and look a little out of place even. However, if you use it, again, in this sort of dry brushing fashion that we've been doing, that's where we're going to get our texture for the bronze itself. So while the bronze at the bottom was laid on thickly, we can just go in with our gold now and very, very, very lightly dry brush it on to the top surfaces of the bronze areas, just to give them a little bit of a glint and a sheen in the sun. I would do the same thing if I was trying to make a aged golden part onto any particular miniature, just because that'll give the gold itself some darker areas that looked a little weathered, maybe patinaed or whatever. So combining the bronze and the gold, in my opinion, is the best way to use either of them. So just keep that in mind as you go forward, and hopefully you can find good ways to put it to use as well. Notably, if you own the Dark Souls board game, Dragon Slayer Ornstein and Executioner Smo would look great with that technique, and I can say that because I painted Ornstein up in exactly that way, and he looks great. For those of you who don't know much about Dark Souls or Dark Souls the board game, those names probably meant nothing to you and I apologize, but I can still swear the bronze and gold working together, when done right, can have a really striking effect. We're now going on to the very last step of painting these miniatures before I would consider them table ready and attractive at that as well. And that is just rimming the bases. So I'm taking some black flow acrylic paint, which is to say it's just a slightly thinner acrylic paint. It's just black stuff, still the cheap Artist's Loft brand from Michael's or available online. But their flow acrylic comes in massive bottles for cheap and is a bit thinner than just the straight up acrylic out of tubes. So I use it for rimming the bases because as it dries it sets up a little bit and smooths itself out thanks to its low viscosity. Drag this around the edge of the base and try to keep the edge of your black rim as straight as possible. If you can't keep it straight, then it shouldn't be all that noticeable because we've textured our base and the colors sort of blend. But if you were to just sort of get big jaggies and warbly edges, you would have a totally different effect than the straight edge. I personally like the straight edge because the appearing like small dioramas that blend in reasonably well with my terrain but pop just a little bit is appealing to me. But you may find that a more warbly and wiggly edge may appeal to you more because it'll make things look a little more, in some cases, like a shadow or something. You could as well edge the bases with a variety of other colors. You could edge them in brown if you wanted it to blend in more with dirt. Or you could edge them in green if you're into the old 1980s and prior sort of wargaming look. Whatever it is you do, though, I do recommend you edge the bases just because, as you've probably noticed, our work with the acrylic paint and the ink and the flock and everything has left a fairly ragged edge around, and we didn't work all the way down over the primer down to the very, very bottom of the bases. So there is gray primer showing as well, which just doesn't look as appealing in my opinion. Putting the edges on these bases is, like I said, the very last step we're going to be doing, and after that you're going to have miniatures that are ready for play, and that should look quite attractive as you play with them. These techniques, while they were quick and relatively simple and use cheap materials, will hopefully have allowed you to get a miniature that looks better than if you were just taking flat acrylic paint and slopping it on. And while that would be even faster, I would argue that doing things this way doesn't take that much more time and gets you that sort of semi-shaded look and a little more detail on the faces that can really, really make your miniatures pop when you're playing with your friends. I hope you agree with that as well, and thank you so much for watching. I hope you've learned something. I hope you've enjoyed it. It's been entertaining. This brings to the end our third series of Painting a Song of Ice and Fire tabletop game miniatures. There are going to be series on other subjects coming soon. I'm balancing some things with work at the moment, and so the update schedule may reduce, particularly as we go into autumn, when I will be having to travel out of town for a prolonged period. That being said, I'll be trying to produce more and more heavily edited episodes if they are going to be coming out more infrequently. So you're going to get more of the sum up style of thing and less of the vlog almost that this is, the real-time painting tutorials. I think these real-time videos have been really helpful for me as far as being able to watch my own work over again, comment on it, think about it, and re-examine my techniques. I hope they've been really useful to you as well, because I found finding videos where I could just follow along with someone in real time was very difficult when I was learning to paint. With all that being said, thank you again for watching. If you've got anything that you'd like to suggest or you'd like to chat with me about, fire it down in the comments or find me on Facebook or Instagram at Jacques of All Games. And you can take a look as well at some of the projects that are on the go and coming up for the future of the channel. Once again, go play some games.